See how this works. Well, welcome back to our Wednesday night study. Glad that you guys are here in this new year. We're going to continue on in the Torah and do a few weeks in Exodus. We're not going to do the whole spring in Exodus. I haven't quite figured out how many we're going to do yet, 4 or 5, depending on how it goes. Exodus has a lot of action at the very beginning. I think I just witnessed a drop. I don't know what just, just happened there. Has a lot of action at the very beginning. God's moving, God's acting, God's working, and then at the end of Exodus you get the description of the building of the tabernacle, which is about as exciting as someone reading blueprints to you, but because basically we're reading blueprints as we do that. But there is a lot to redeem in that as well, and so we'll fight through a little bit of that, but not too much. There's some really neat stuff going on there. But to start it, I thought we would start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start most of the time. These are the names, which is actually the title of the book in Hebrew. Like most ancient Near Eastern documents, you get the title from the first word. So Genesis is in Hebrew titled in the beginning, and Exodus is titled, these are the names. Of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. This is going to be important information later on as we get into that's grandkids too. That's not just, it wasn't just his kids. That's everybody. That's what it meant, the whole family. Sorry, Cheryl had a small stroke over here. Talk with her. That's everyone who belonged to Jacob is the message there.
Okay.
Was 70. That is going to be important later on when we talk about the number of people that went out of Egypt. Cecil B. DeMille and I had a disagreement over exactly how many that was. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Verse 8. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. The identity of Pharaoh is unknown from the biblical text. Pharaoh thought himself to be a manifestation of the divine on earth, and the Bible goes out of its way to never mentioning Pharaoh's name. There is no greater slap in the face that you can do to not even mention the individual's name in this story. This is a deliberate slight, which is a great show of disrespect and really frustrating for those of us who'd like to have some idea of when we're talking about here, because we don't know exactly what we're talking. So there's a lot of speculation. A couple of pharaohs that we can talk about. Ahmose the first drove the Hyksos rulers from the Egyptian Delta about 1550. Did anyone pay close enough attention last year to remember who the Hyksos were? I know.
Foreign rulers.
Yeah, foreign rulers is correct.
Levantine origin.
Correct. They were foreign rulers of Levantine origin who took over Egypt and allowed for the possibility of the rise of Joseph historically. That provides some historical credibility. That was the name of that group. In 1550, the last of them was driven out of the lower Egypt, which is the northern part, the delta region of Egypt, back into Levant. So Ahmose is sometimes thought of as possibly the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, someone who not only did not know about Joseph, but also was not connected to him ethnically, or at least related in some way ethnically, like the Hyksos rulers would have been. They were a Semitic people as well. So this native Egyptian pharaoh, Ahmose, and that maybe he did not know Joseph. Most of the time, Seti, at least all the movies pick Seti the first, so that must be true, right? Everybody picks Seti the first. But it is some good history, I think, to think about it that way. He began building projects in the Delta. Most pharaohs did most of their building in Upper Egypt, Thebes, about 400 miles away. Temple of Karnak, all of that is up there, upstream from the river. So down south, but upriver. So it works just like Kentucky does. I don't know if you know that Kentucky is like that. North is down because all the creeks. Yeah, exactly. Because all the creeks go that way. So most people identify Seti as the pharaoh of the oppression. Most people identify Ramses II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. He's a good candidate for it. He had 200 wives and concubines, between 44 and 56 sons, over 40 daughters. He was He outlived his first dozen heirs. That's got to be frustrating, right? If you're going to get to be the Pharaoh, but you died before your father, and so you didn't. I think of Charles on that in some ways. I think Elizabeth may outlive Charles the way things are going. But he's a really good candidate, the major builder of the New Kingdom, probably one of the strongest of the New Kingdom. And what better narrative than to have the greatest Pharaoh of the New Kingdom be humbled by this group of Israelites and the God of, this is good storytelling, I think. So it makes some good sense here. The capital is also built in the Delta, and this is important. Seti and Ramses' capitals were in the Delta, and that's where land of Goshen is. That's where the Hebrews are. And it does seem in the storytelling that when Moses is going back and forth from the Hebrews to the court of Pharaoh, he's not making a 400-mile trip. And any other setting of the Exodus, that's what you'd have to believe. That every time he left the Hebrews to go talk to Pharaoh, that he had to go up to Thebes, and then he had to come back down. It does seem that everything's pretty local in that area. And Pi Ramses is mentioned, and it was something that was built in that area. But other than that, no other clues as to what setting we're trying to talk about. But obviously, huge lifespan here. He lived 90 years. I've seen some estimates at 96, depending on how they're counting. Math always gets complicated, but he did pretty well. He was doing all right there. Questions on our Pharaoh of the Exodus possibilities? Because this is the best part of this story to me, that you don't mention Pharaoh, right? We have no idea who Pharaoh is at all. The guy who thinks himself God on earth. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other named Puah. Did you get that? No name for Pharaoh. But we get the Hebrew midwives' names. The very bottom of the social ladder here, there's Shiphrah and Puah that get named here. When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, she shall live. So the plan was to breed them away. But the midwives feared God, did not do as king of Egypt commanded them, let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're more vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. There's a lot of information here that we're going to talk about, some of it next week. Some of it's important in just a little bit. And then some of it, we'll say I'll probably cover all of it next week. So just remember this part of this story, because it is going to come into play later. But certainly neat that the midwives actually get families of their own. They actually get their names. They're actually honored in that way, an honor that Pharaoh doesn't get. It's this wonderful social low being lifted up and the high being cast down again. It's just the kind of thing God does in this story. So, yes, sir. Oh, no, you're just cheering on God. Yeah. I'm a big fan myself. Even some of his early work that a lot of people don't like. I'm a big fan. Okay. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married I love how the way they phrase this, because it sounds like some of my family talks in Kentucky, right? Well, he just went and married, he went and married a Levite woman. But that's actually two verbs in Hebrew. Went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, well, which one? What mother wouldn't say that her child was a fine baby? My mother said that I was an ugly baby, but that's a separate issue. She said, well, she didn't say I was an ugly baby. She said my head was too big. That's what she said. It just looked weird. My brother was a beautiful baby. He also folded his hands for his baby picture. He did. In his baby, you look at my brother's baby picture in the hospital, hands are folded as if in prayer, as his eyes closed.
Still that annoying?
Yeah. Love him, but he's probably not watching. Anyway, I wish he was. He was a fine baby, but she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him. Same Hebrew word as the thing that Noah built, an ark. She built an ark for him. I'm assuming that his was much smaller. I think that there's an interesting lexical connection there. Plastered it with bitumen and pitch, put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. A lot of ways this is done. In the movies, for dramatic effect, she's always putting him in the river and then, right if you get work, and off he goes, fearing crocodiles and boats and hippopotami. My feeling of this is that as I read this story, I really honestly believe she knew where Pharaoh's daughter tended to bathe. that knowing mothers as I do. That's not in the Bible. That's my reading of the story and reading of the mother's story. And then reading what's about to happen. By the way, daughter of Pharaoh. In the movies, it's always the daughter of Pharaoh. But if it is Ramses, this is one of 40 people that this could be that's down by the Nile. So hard to know. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw a child who was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children. How would she know this?
Duh.
Duh? Who else is throwing their kid in the Nile? Or
He's a boy.
Circumcision,
right?
and he's, yes, likely circumcised, yes. So he doesn't have a sign. I'm one of the Hebrew children. Yeah, probably circumcised. Circumcision, not all too common. It was done in some of the upper classes of Egyptian society, but not anybody who would throw their kid in the Nile. So it's a good guess that he's a Hebrew child. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Now, I don't know if there's a lot of winking going on here that the Bible's not recording, if there's a sort of knowing conversation. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But Pharaoh's daughter said, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child, nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. She took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So the implication here is Pharaoh's mother gets to raise Moses for a time, at least until he's weaned. We don't know in this story at what point Moses knows that Moses is a Hebrew. I mean, in the movies, it's always a dramatic reveal, right? It has to be because it's a movie and you need that moment. But there seems to be nothing in this to indicate that he wouldn't have known growing up. We don't know how much contact he continued to have. Yeah?
Well, two obvious observations just right at this point.
Sure.
First, you've got a mass slaughter of the innocents.
Correct.
And one baby is protected. That
Yes.
has to be stated, it's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, you now have, after Joseph, you have a second Hebrew intersecting the Pharaonic family.
Yes, you do.
Wow, figure the odds.
Yeah, yes, that's absolutely right. And it's going to uniquely qualify him for later on. Even though Moses protests that he can't do this job, there's no one else who would be better suited to do this job. His familiarity with the royal court, having grown up with it, his ability to speak Egyptian, having grown up with it, his knowledge of the wilderness, having spent a generation in it. I mean, Moses is the only person who could have done this job, and so uniquely suited for this as a result of that experience.
I have a theory about the daughter.
The daughter of Pharaoh.
Not too many daughters could get away with this, given the Pharaoh's position.
Maybe,
Hebrew boys.
Unless there's 40 of the daughters that all have their own kids, and he's just one more in
Hard to notice.
Hard to know. At what point do you? Is there I don't have a large enough family to know there's a critical mass of when you don't notice one more person at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
I don't know where that is.
It's
but
much lower than that.
It's got to be
number.
lower than 40 with
Yeah.
kids. I just,
My Mormon friends say it's 5.
5. After that, you don't notice anymore. Yeah, Bob.
The question of the killing of these.
Yes, the killing of the
infants.
innocents. Yeah.
So we have that here, and then we have it again
In Matthew.
in Matthew's
Yes.
story. And is that a practice that was
Well,
used, often, sometimes, frequently in the cultures of?
infanticide was not unknown within families. I mean, children were left to die of exposure if a family couldn't afford them. Female children
Yeah.
typically.
Yeah, but
And
this
so
is government-wide.
It is government-wide, but I guess what I'm saying is
Nationwide.
there's a culture of devaluing infants at that point. And I think that this is perfectly in keeping with Pharaoh. Yes, it's perfectly in keeping with the national. This is something that the Assyrians would do. This is something that Babylonians. In fact, one of I will go ahead and say my very least favorite book in the entire Bible. Well, no, I'm talking about that. We'll talk about that later. Nahum is my least favorite book. That's the story. Psalm 137 is when the psalmist is crying out to God and asking God to bless whoever does to our enemies, Babylon, what they did to us. Happy shall be they who take your little ones and dash them against the rocks. So that was apparently the practice of the Babylonians as well, to prevent anyone to grow up and need to seek vengeance. Right? I mean, you're just eliminating the line. And Hosea talked about the Assyrians doing this for Israel as well at the end of Hosea. In fact, he says, put the infants to the sword and rip open the pregnant women. So at that point, even attacking the women at that point. So yeah, this was national policy. So I guess it's not surprising that this would happen. Yeah. Yeah, by the way, Psalm 137, take the babies and dash them against the rocks. It's a worship psalm. It's grab the babies and throw them against the rocks. Yeah, like everybody sing. No, just a minute. One day, oh wait, I was Moses' name. That's right. It's an Egyptian name. Moses means to give life. You already saw it twice today. Ra, Moses, and Mos. Gives life, and Ra gives life or gives birth. So a thoroughly Egyptian name. In Hebrew, it means to draw out, which is the pun that they're making here. So she's given him life, but in Hebrew, he's going to draw out the Israel. Everybody lives into their name in the Old Testament, right? So he's drawing the Israelites out of Egypt. She's saying it's because he drew them out of the water. So a little play on that name there. Yeah, thoroughly Egyptian name.
Who gave her the name Miriam?
What's that? Oh, you don't know. We don't have the name yet.
Okay.
Yeah, Miriam's not. That's later. She is his sister, and that's the sister that we're talking about here, but her name isn't given yet.
Okay.
And Moses' mother is not named in the text. She's named in the Talmud, but she's not named in the text. I can't remember her name now. I haven't read the Talmud in a while. Don't preach on that much. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. So he knew he was a Hebrew at this point. In the movies, there's the dramatic reveal right here that's not spoken. Saw the forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, seeing no one. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he said to one who was in the wrong, why do you strike your fellow Hebrew? He answered, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So it has been revealed, and he's right to be afraid. So Moses runs. He fled Pharaoh, settled in the land of Midian. Midian later on enemies of Israel. So this is very much like the David story. When Saul is after David, he goes to work for the Philistines, which would never work. And I mean, that's like an M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end of a movie. David kills Goliath and then goes to work for the Philistines. Here, Moses flees Pharaoh and goes to live in the Midianites. For Israel, they're having a hard time hearing that. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water, filled the troughs with water for their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up, came to their defense, and watered the flock. What's about to happen here? We learned this. Someone's about to get married. Exactly.
They're at a well.
They're at a well, and he meets the women there, and the women rush off to their father. This is the type scene. The minute you get into the story, you know someone's about to get married. All right? When they return to their father, Reuel, by the way, notice their father's name. Reuel. This is going to be important too in a second. He said, how is it you've come back so soon? They said, an Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son and named him Refugee. That's what Gershon means. Because he said, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. So he names this child Gershon, refugee. His name is Refugee. That literally is, his name is Refugee. That's what his name means, Gershon. So, all right, how we doing?
So Moses is clearly not a favored son of Pharaoh. He's one of
Right.
Only 200.
He's one of over 200 or so.
He's a grandson.
Yeah, that's true. He's one of the, I don't know how many grandsons he'd have. Yeah.
Like half the city.
A lot. Yeah. He's building the city himself.
The idea that he has to get out of Dodge is not.
Yeah, makes sense. He's not going to be favored or protected. In the movies, he is. Yeah, it makes a better movie that way.
So this is another one where you skip from the birth to the adulthood.
Correct.
Just, leave out the 25 years.
Because that's all that's really important here. is the generation, how did they come about? Probably through miraculous and something special happens. And then now what they do. So.
That'd be a humbling message for the youth group.
yes, it would. We won't teach them that much. They're probably not watching. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. So we're assuming Seti. Maybe. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. That's a onomatopoetic word in Hebrew. Zak. It's like, ah. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then I love this last verse, and the English doesn't do it justice here. I love this last verse. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This is a very short verse in Hebrew. And what it says is, God saw them, and God knew. That's all it says, is that he remembered his covenant, he saw them, and he knew. Two things that are fascinating about that to me. One, God saw them is you might remember, exactly the same verb that Hagar uses and that Abraham uses in both of their moments of crisis. Is that my phone that's doing that? I think it is.
Sorry,
It's your phone? Okay, I didn't know who it was. I thought I turned it down. Hagar, when she names God, she names him Elroy, remember? The God who sees. That's what Elroy means, the God who sees. When Abraham finds the ram caught in the thicket, he names the place Yahweh Yirah, the Lord who will see. The Lord will see. And so here, God has seen. So seeing has always carried that notion of provision to it. So I really think that this God sees could also be God provided, or seeing with the intent of providing, or God. I think that this is God's taken some steps here. The ram's caught in the thicket, the water's been provided to Hagar, Moses is getting ready to, it's really, God's taken steps. He's not passive in this story. God is acting here. God knew. I just love, that is such a powerful way to end a chapter. God looked, and God saw, and God knew. And remember that word knowledge, yada, is a word that carries with it a deep association of not just awareness, but intimacy at times, right? Adam knew his wife Eve, Cain knew his wife. And that there's an association of God with the suffering and with the people in saying that God knew is a connection there, that God took notice of them is just not strong enough in that translation. It's just too weak in that. So, anyway, thoughts, questions? I get wound up about that because I love that verse. It's God saw and God knew. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian. Anything you want to talk about there? Anything interesting? Anything that you notice that might be significant from the previous chapter? What was Zipporah's dad's name?
Different name.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It was Raul.
Oh.
Yeah. And yet here is Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. So, Zipporah's dad is specifically named Ruel. That's what it said. But here, father-in-law Jethro. So what's going on with it? Well, two names, right? I've got two, Robert Edward, Robert William, everybody's got, no, that's not the way I read this, okay? What I think is happening here is that Ruel is in fact Zipporah's dad. No problem. But I think between chapter 2 and 3, it is likely, in this generation that Moses has been in the wilderness, it is likely that Ruel has passed on, and Zipporah's brother has taken over the patriarchy of the family. He's in charge now. And so this word, chotain, father-in-law, in Hebrew, is a word that is relationship by marriage, close relationship by marriage, in a power structure situation. So the natural is father-in-law, but I think for us probably patriarch-in-law would be a better translation of Jethro here. In fact, I think Jethro probably her brother, not her dad. Yeah.
Chance also that he was Ruel's brother. Ruel,
Maybe,
he married
maybe if Ruel didn't have any sons, yeah, very possibly. Whoever the leadership of the family fell to, that's who it's going to be. Yeah.
No, there are no textual hints, like either from language or otherwise, that it's double tradition.
No. Well, I think I think there are those who call it a double tradition, and I think it's possible it's a double tradition, but
that's like the first explanation that comes to my mind, but
yeah.
it's not the easiest.
Yeah, that two different sources have been redacted together is what he's thinking about here. One source had it as Ruel, one source had it as Jethro, and that's totally possible. I have no problems. I mean, Jethro seems to be a pretty vital guy in this story, and so I have no problems reading this probably a patriarch-in-law as opposed to father-in-law. So, priest of Midian. So he's a religious individual working in this Canaanite, well, basically Midianite religion. Led his flock beyond the wilderness. Oh, also, he's keeping the flock of his father-in-law. He's been here a generation. He's not making a family of his own. He's still under the employ of Jethro. He's still working for. He's not gone on to establish his own house or he's not making a life for himself exactly in Midian. He's working for Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel, messenger of the Lord, appeared to him in the flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. I heard a great sermon once by an individual talking about the importance of Moses turning aside. That he could have he saw this great event and could have kept on walking. And sometimes we see God move and we just keep on walking. But here God's moving and he turned aside. It was a great sermon. I was all wound up at the end. Ready to go. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside, see how important that is? To see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. You know, if God says something once, it's important. When God repeats himself, it's a big deal. Abraham, Abraham, Mary, Mary, Samuel, Samuel. Anytime you get that double address, that's a big deal. Moses said, here I am. Anytime you get, here I am. It's about to be a tough call. This is what Mary does right before she hears from Gabriel. This is what Abraham does right before he's asked to offer Isaac. This is what Samuel gets before he has to tell Eli his kids are about to die as a child. So this is always a tough, here I am. That's always tough. Then he said, come no closer, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Still not Israel, bless his heart. Even God's not using his new name. That's rough. Anyway, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have observed, I have seen, the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And that is know. That's a literal translation. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I love Moses' argument here. This is what I'm always reminded, that God is always working at the faith capacity of his audience. God is never going to reveal God's word to you beyond your ability to have to exercise faith. And I guess what I mean by that is, if I walk outside the church and the bush starts talking to me, I do what the bush says. I don't argue with the bush. Moses walks out and sees a bush talking and is willing to argue with the bush for 2 chapters. This is obviously someone whose faith is able to still be exercised while seeing a theophany right in front of him. So I think that God reveals God's self to us in ways. When people ask, why doesn't God manifest himself the way now that he did that? I said, well, because we couldn't show faith then anymore. It's no longer faith when there's no choice. When the bush tells me to do something, I do what the bush says. Or I seek help. I mean, those are the 2 options. Here, Moses decides to argue with the bush for 2 whole chapters. But Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I love this part. And God says, I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. So Moses' first complaint is, who am I? God says, well, you're the person that I've chosen. And then Moses says, well, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors sent me, and they say, what is his name? What shall I say to them? So he says, well, who are you? Right? This is the response. Who am I? Who are you? God said to Moses, Etyeh Esher Etyeh. That's what God says in Hebrew. Etyeh Esher Etyeh. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Etyeh has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This my title for all generations. Well, let's look at Etyeh Esher Etyeh in Hebrew. Etyeh is the first person of the to be verb. Esher is a relative pronoun, who, which, that. And Etyeh, again, same as the first word, first person of the to be verb. However, there is no tense in Hebrew. So not the same way we use tense. In Hebrew, you have action which is complete and action that's incomplete. And so those can represent past, present, or future, or causative, or intensive, or any of those things. And so in English, if you want to render this, there are any of these ways to render this are totally fair. Pick one from column A, one from column B, and one from column C, and you will render that phrase correctly. God could be saying to Moses, I was what I was what I was what I will be, or I am what I was, I am what I am, or I am what I will be, or I will be what I was, I will be what I am, I will be what I will be, or what, or who, or that. And the way that the to be verb works with the The 3 letters there, that's the 3 root letters. When you inflect verbs into a causal stem, a little grammar for you tonight. In Hebrew, there is a causal stem. In other words, you can take a verb and make it causative. So instead of guarding, he guarded him, I can say he caused him to be guarded, or he caused him to guard him, right? Or he slept, he caused to sleep. When you put verbs that look like this into the causal stem, it looks kind of like God's name. And so W.F. Albright in the beginning of the 20th century suggested actually what we have here is a causative form of the to be verb. So it's actually I cause to be what I will cause to be. In other words, God is saying, I am creator. What I love about this phrase, love about this whole section here, is that if names give insight into character, and people live into their names in the Old Testament, I love that God's is just a little bit hard to pin down. Exactly who and what God is bigger than it seems you can really grasp and understand. Now, when the Greek translation of the Hebrew was done, the Septuagint, it made it present tense, because Greek has tenses like we have tenses. And so it made I am who I am. And so those I am sayings in John and in the New Testament are referencing Septuagint translation there, because that's important in the interpretation for them. The Hebrew, however, is wide open in its understanding of the nature of who God is. Here's the other one more funny thing about that. God's name Yahweh is the inflected form of the first person. In other words, they actually conjugate God's name. God says, I am, and the people call him, he is. They use the third person back when it says, you will call me, he is. Which is weird, because I don't normally inflect people's names, right? I had a friend in high school whose last name was Wint. We didn't call him Go when we talked about him in the present tense. But apparently you can do that. So. Ray, did you have a thought, or? No. No, okay. Sorry, you look like you kind
This
of want
might be a time for a Cecil B. DeMille strategic
Yes,
goals
yes.
and invoke archaeology.
Please.
Maybe I missed Hyksos aside, and Ramses the Great aside.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed how the Hebrews became enslaved in the first place.
That was the end of Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah, because Joseph invented slavery to help people pay off Pharaoh and buy grain. And that kind of came back to bite them once he wasn't related to Pharaoh anymore.
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of archaeology.
Oh, sure.
Up on the Giza Plateau.
Sure.
Specifically.
Of course.
Over the past 20 years. And the one thing that is now firmly established is that the folks that built, not just the pyramid, but all those great
Structures.
edifices, this was not done with slave labor. This was done by skilled
Sure.
middle-class craftsmen.
Correct. Well, the design of them, certainly, yeah.
Well, they found the places where all these people lived.
Were living, yes, the
They hadn't
quarters,
found-
right.
And there's no like mass camps where the slaves lived.
Correct.
Aside from some mass burial pits
Sure.
possibly from today. But the question then becomes, what are these slaves doing there?
Right.
Is it just, okay, it's a slave labor society, I get that, but in what economic or social context do we place the presence of these Hebrews in Egypt, I guess?
Part of the trouble that we're going to have here is that what the numbers that Cecil B. DeMille is talking about, which is I think 2.5 million, is 2 orders of magnitude off for what it probably is at this point. In other words, we're talking about a much smaller group of people than, and we'll talk about why that is next week, but the archaeological evidence for a group of this size probably is going to be much more scant than the notion that, 2.5 million people leave a trace, 25,000 don't. And so as much as this. Most of the buildings that are in the northern part of Egypt, in Lower Egypt, the Great Pyramids, they're 2,000 years old by the time we get to, they're 1,000 years old by the time we get to this anyway. So it isn't going to be that scale of building that we're talking about either. You're exactly right about who's doing that. So I guess at the end of the day, I want to say archaeology is just problematic.
Well, this is just a big hole, is what I'm
It
saying.
is,
in
it
terms
is.
of what these Hebrews are doing there.
Correct.
At
It
this
is.
time.
But now that said, the Egyptians had no problem enslaving everyone. They were among the most racist, nationalistic group in the ancient Near East. They looked down on the Semites, they looked down on the Cushites, they looked down on the Puttites. They were willing to take as slaves anybody. Sub-Saharan Africa, Puttites would be Libya, Cushites would be Ethiopia, they were happy, obviously Semites are coming from the Levant, happy to enslave anyone and use them at that point. So I mean, that is something that is found in the documentation of the Egyptians. So it is at least in keeping with their MO, if we can't find the archaeological evidence of it. Yeah. The setting of this, for reasons that I won't expound on, many conservative interpreters put the Exodus back in the 16th century BC. Most more, and I'm going to say reliable interpretations, it has to do with how you read the numbers in the book of Judges, is frankly how it all goes, and I won't bore you with how that all goes. But the 13th century BC seems a much more reliable. That's the Seti, Ramses setting. That's where all the movies pick. That's where most of the chronologies go. Some of the older Bibles, more the Ryries and such, they might put it back in the 16th century. They consider Amos the pharaoh that they're concerned with, which is too early. It's too long, the time period at that point. So, other questions about God? Believe it or not, I haven't taught you the one thing you'll never forget about this. Well, there's two things you'll never forget about this. If you have Yahweh, which this is Etyeh, not Yahweh, but the same name, and you don't have vowels in your manuscript, that's fine. That's no problem. But when the Masoretic Jews come along in the 4th to 10th century AD, and they've devised a vowel system that goes around the letters, and you come to God's personal name, and you want to put vowels in God's personal name, you got a problem. Because if you put vowels on God's name and someone's reading the manuscript and they don't realize God's name is coming, they could read God's name with a bad attitude and take it in vain, even reading it from Scripture. So the Masoretic Jews needed to make sure that God's name would be mispronounced, because you don't want to say it right. Because if you say it right, you could be in trouble, right? You could take it in vain. So for those of you on the men's retreat, this is no surprise for you. But for those of you who are not, here's some news for you. What they did was take the consonants for Yahweh, and they took the vowels for Adonai, and when you run that through Greek and Latin, you get the word, and German, you get the word Jehovah. So you get Yahweh, or Yahovai, which then by the time you run it through all the languages you needed to run it through to get to us in the King James, it becomes Jehovah. The word Jehovah is a totally made up word so that you don't accidentally say the name of God correctly and therefore take it in vain. So, that's, I thought you'd like to know that. That's always fun for me. Here's the vowels, by the way. The little dot's there, the little dot there, the little dot there. And they put that around it. And so the King James, when they were translated, they just transliterated that and made it Jehovah. So the early King James all had Jehovah. That's where the name came from. If you share this information, the Jehovah's Witnesses don't visit you anymore. I found that out. I just asked them why they would do that, and they don't come by my house anymore. I'm on a list, I guess. That's what that means. Anyway. But one night I shared this in Bible study, and it was at a church where Cindy was a music minister. And choir practice was right after Sunday night Bible study, so I talked about all this in Sunday night Bible study, and they were like, wow, I just had no idea. And of course, half of my class is in choir, and so they go off to choir. And of course, because God has a sense of humor, Cindy has chosen Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah as a Sunday hymn. At which point, one of the choir members goes, I don't know if I can sing this after what I just learned about in Dr. Wallace's Bible study. And someone else wondered, well, what'd you learn? Well, yeah, Jehovah's Man. Cindy completely lost control of the choir practice, and it was my fault, apparently, because that's how marriage works. What are you going to do? Anyway, that was so funny. I remember that. That was so good. Anyway, back to the story. But Moses said, he's still arguing, right? We're in chapter 4 now, still going. Finally he goes, this is the big one. This is the one that upset God. God was patient with the rest of them. This one really triggered God. But Moses said to the Lord, my Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you've spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who gives speech to mortals? This is the one time he shot back at Moses on this one. He's like, you know what? It's been 2 chapters. Pretty sure I made you. Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with you in your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. But he said, my Lord, please send someone else. That's what this whole thing boils down to. All right? He finally said what he finally meant in the last chapter. I don't want to go. And this, by the way, good indication of a prophetic call Anyone who has a prophetic call realizes they have a prophetic call and doesn't want to do what God has asked them to do. No prophet ever wants to do what God asked them to do. They're never eager for this opportunity. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses and said, "What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak fluently. Even now he's coming out to meet you. When he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him, put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you. You shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform the signs." So Aaron now is the prophet for Moses in the way that Moses is the prophet for God. That's the way this is going to go. So anytime after this that Moses speaks, it's Aaron speaking. But the text just reads it as Moses speaking, because everywhere else in the book, whenever a prophet speaks, thus says the Lord. Right? That's just the way you tell the story.
Have I read once that one interpretation of this is that Moses clinically
Was a stutterer?
Is that-
That's one interpretation of it, sure.
We're not missing anything in translation.
No, there's nothing explicit about it. He's just trying to get out of this job. Please send someone else. He says feebly. Then he goes back to Jethro. I find that what he says to Jethro is interesting. Moses went back to his father-in-law, his patriarch-in-law Jethro, and said, "Please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they're still living." Well, that's not what God said. That's interesting. Anyway, he doesn't say too much. Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead." He's a priest, so I guess he could know that sort of thing. So Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. So he is bringing along the life that he's made for himself in Midian and heading back. Now, I'm about to share with you a story that once I tell you, it may cause some stress. I just want you to know. It is one part of the Moses story that is never represented in any movie that I have ever seen.
Is it the
And there's
foreskin?
a reason for that. What's that?
Is it the foreskin thing?
It is. You're welcome. Anyone who starts a story by identifying it as the foreskin thing should have you all very nervous now, right? Now you've all sufficiently, the anxiety level should go up.
I don't know, but some of it's not bothering me at all.
Well, the story can be troubling because it's really strange. That's why the story is troubling. And the best thing to say about it is it's the foreskin story.
This is why I was lobbying for Exodus last time.
I see. I understand. This story. Well,
You solved that this
maybe I can help with this story, and the rest will be downhill. God has just spent 2 chapters talking Moses into coming. Right? He's just spent this long a time trying to get Moses to go. Finally, yelling at him, sending Aaron. He's come down. A lot of work has gone into getting Moses to go. Right? So finally, Moses is going to go. He's got his donkey, got his kids, got his wife, and so let's go to 24. On the way to Egypt, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him. Well, that's an odd twist in the story, don't you think? I mean, seems odd that God would show up. Don't worry, it gets weirder. But Zipporah took a flint, cut off her son's foreskin, touched Moses' feet with it, and said, "Truly, you're a bridegroom of blood to me." So he, that is God, let him alone. It was then, she said, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision. Well, that was a close one, apparently. So I really don't know what's weirder here. That God tried to kill Moses? I mean, what's that? Like he missed? Like Moses is shifty? What is that? What Zipporah does, that Zipporah knows what to do, or that what Zipporah does makes God happy. There's a lot to choose from here on what's the weirdest part of this passage. All right? This is odd. No one ever tells this part of the story in any movie that I've ever seen. Anyone see this in a movie? I wouldn't think. No. I have a theory. I will confess it is my interpretation of this. It is supported by other people's readings, but I've never seen anyone actually put, it's probably been said, but I should probably try and find who, so if they haven't, I could get it out there and get published. But what I think of is this. Moses goes into the wilderness, the Midianites, and he is not, I guess the best way to say it is, he didn't seek God's advice on this when he fled from Pharaoh. He just ran to the Midianites. He didn't seem to seek God's advice in marrying Zipporah. Neither did he seem to seek God's advice in having Gershom, who is clearly uncircumcised and not being raised in a Hebrew faith at this point. I think the problem we've got here is that Moses is trying to go and do this mission for God while bringing along the Midianite life he has made for himself, working for his father-in-law Jethro, bringing along his Midianite wife, bringing along his Midianite son. And God is asking for Moses to, I guess in Baptist terms we would say, have a rededication, re-Hebrew himself, if you will. And as a result, what we have here is a symbolic circumcision. And this is the important piece of information that will come up in other places, though I don't know how much. And you have to be careful who you share this with. So be careful who you share this with. Going out on the internet, so it's a secret. On occasion in the Old Testament, I want to emphasize all of that sentence. On occasion and Old Testament. These are two important parts of that sentence, okay? The word feet can be used as a euphemism for genitals. So that what is happening here is a symbolic circumcision of Moses. She cuts the foreskin off of Gershom and touches Moses' feet with it. A couple other places you will notice that is in Isaiah 6, when the seraphim are flying around the throne room of God. They have 6 wings. With 2 they fly, with 2 they cover their face to not look upon God, and with 2 they cover their feet. They are modest before God. In the Talmud, urine is called water of the feet. Some other places where feet is used as a euphemism. I'll ruin 2 stories for you. How about that? In the book of Ruth, she uncovers Boaz's feet with it at the end of that story. And he says, surely this kindness is greater than any you've ever shown. So, yeah, it's not an uncommon euphemism that you get in the story. So I think that helps understand this is a rededication of Moses as he goes back into the story. I say that because after this event, Zipporah is sent away. We don't know when she is sent away. We only know that after the Exodus, it says, Zipporah came back after Moses had sent her away. That word sent away is also the Hebrew word for divorce. So it is very possible that following this event, he is setting aside this, and we don't hear of her in Egypt. We don't hear of her while he's talking to Pharaoh. That he sends her away, and he does set aside that Midianite life. And she is only welcomed back when she and Jethro are worshipers of Yahweh. See, foreign wives are okay, provided that they are worshipers of Yahweh. Foreign wives, it's always been a religious concern. It's never been a racial or ethnic concern in the Old Testament. So it seems, I think that's what makes the most sense of this setting. It's still a weird story. I'm not going to say it's not a weird story, but I think that helps. So, how are we doing? Yeah? All right. Well, the good news is they find Aaron. Aaron's happy to do the job and becomes the spokesperson, and they go back to meet Pharaoh, and that sets us up for next week for the great Pharaoh meeting. So, but nobody tell John what feet can be or anything else. Or where Jehovah comes from. That's what he gets for walking away. Oh, darn it, he was watching. Any questions, comments, concerns, diatribe, violent opposition?
Was the staff thing significant?
The fact that he uses the staff?
The staff of God, and he had a staff with it back a few verses
He did.
later, and
he raises the staff. And
didn't he do some kind of a
does a neat trick with it? He does it with his hand, and he does the staff thing. Yeah, the staff. I will say, staff is a homophone in Hebrew with the word tribe. So I've often wondered if there's something happening there that I don't quite get in the pun. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I mean, shepherd staff and kingship, and you can do a lot with staff, I think, there, but I didn't tonight, but I think you can.
Yeah, I just now I said, God said, what's that in your hand? He said, a staff.
Yeah.
Threw it on the ground, he threw it, it became a snake.
Yep.
Moses jumped back.
Yeah.
Fast.
Yes, he did.
That's the message.
Yeah, you would. So. Any others? All right, well, I will let you go, and I will see you. Thank you again for coming. It was good.
Just in time.
What's that?
Just in time.
Just in time to dismiss. That's right. So have a great week. Have a great choir practice. Have a great handbell practice.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Singing about Jehovah.
And don't sing about Jehovah on Sunday. Well, you can.